The loader was already swinging 400 sacks of rotting potatoes toward the dumpster when a 20-year-old stepped in front of it and raised his hand. "Stop the machine. I'm buying all of it." The operator laughed. "Son, this is garbage. You couldn't feed it to a hog." "I'm not feeding it to a hog. Load it onto my truck." Then Garrett Pike's voice carried across the lot. "That's the brickfield, boy. Eli, that ground beat your granddad for 20 years. A real farmer, better than you'll ever be. And you're gonna fix it with rot?" Eli didn't argue. He just started loading. Because he'd seen something in those 400 sacks that nobody else could. So, what was it? The dock crew laughed, but Deacon, the young man who worked the back platform, laughed first and hardest, then caught himself when he realized Eli wasn't smiling along. Eli had walked up to the loader operator with the flat calm of a man stating a fact about the weather, and the operator had cut the engine, because there is nothing else to do when a person stands that close to a moving bucket and tells you to stop. "You want these?" the operator said. It wasn't quite a question. "All of them," Eli said. Phil Gentry came out of the loading bay wiping his hands on the front of his apron. He was the market manager, and he had the look of a man who had already priced the situation in his head and found it strange. He glanced at the 400 sacks slumped against the back wall of the building, then at the young man standing in front of them, and he said the young man's name the way people in Cedar County said it, with a small softening on the end, the way you say the name of somebody's kid you've watched grow up. "Eli, there's 400 sacks back here. They're done. Sprouted, soft. Half of them are more water than potato at this point." "I know what they are," Eli said. "You want 400 sacks of rot. I want 400 sacks of potatoes. What they are is my business once they're on my truck." A couple of the dock hands drifted over, the way men do when something out of the ordinary is happening and the work can spare 5 minutes. One of them, older, with a Cedar County feed cap pushed back off his forehead, looked at the sacks, then at Eli, and spoke in a voice that wasn't cruel but wasn't warm either. "Son, those potatoes are already trying to crawl out of the bag on their own." That got a laugh. Another one, younger, decided to try his own hand at it. "You planting supper or burying evidence?" Eli let it move past him. He had been letting things move past him his whole life, and he had gotten good enough at it that people sometimes mistook the stillness for slowness, which suited him fine because it meant they said more than they meant to, and he learned things. He learned who laughed to be cruel and who laughed because a crowd was laughing. He learned who watched him a beat longer than the joke called for. He filed all of it away the same way he filed everything. Then Garrett Pike's voice came from the far end of the dock, and it changed the temperature of the whole lot. Garrett had pulled up for feed and wandered over to see what the small crowd was about, and when he understood what he was looking at, a 20-year-old buying a truckload of spoil for a field everybody in the county had a name for, he didn't hold anything back. He was a big man with a big man's ease in a crowd, and he had known Eli's grandfather going back 30 years, and he used that knowing like a tool. "That ground of yours can't grow a decent weed, and now you're feeding it trash." The laughing rose a notch. Garrett wasn't finished. "Your granddad had 20 good years and real seed money behind him, Eli. He put a drain line in that field a contractor charged him for. He knew that dirt better than you'll ever know it, and it beat him every season he tried. You've got dumpster potatoes and a field that already whipped a better farmer than you'll live to be. So what exactly do you figure changes?" That one landed harder than the rest, and Garrett knew it, and he let a small, satisfied smile settle onto his face. The kind a man gets when he's found the soft place and pressed on it without quite admitting to himself that's what he's doing. Eli didn't answer him. He had learned a long time ago, without anyone ever saying it to him in words, just by watching Moses Freeman live it, that answering a man like that, in a moment like that, only fed the moment and starved you. So he walked to his truck instead. He backed it up to the loading dock, and he started moving sacks. They were heavy in the way healthy potatoes are never heavy. Wet heavy. Some had gone soft clear through the bottom and left dark stains on the concrete where they'd sat. and the smell came up off them as he worked. Not overpowering, but present. The specific sweet rot of a vegetable coming apart. He worked steadily, one sack at a time, and he didn't rush, and he didn't look back at the men. And after a while, the crowd got bored the way a crowd does when the person it came to watch refuses to give it a show. Phil Gentry took the end of a sack after a minute, mostly out of habit, because he was a working man, and standing there watching a person load alone went against something built into him. "You sure about this?" Phil said, meant just for Eli and not the crowd. "No," Eli said, "but I'm doing it anyway." Phil almost smiled at that and didn't. Before Eli pulled the tailgate up, the older man added something else, lower still, aimed away from the men behind him. "Every grower on Miller Creek is coming up short this spring. Whatever you think you're doing, the county could use it working out." Eli filed that away without answering it. He caught the last of the jokes through his open window as he pulled out onto the gravel, one of the hands calling to another, loud enough to carry across the lot, something about how the boy was going to need more trucks than that once the smell really came on. He didn't look back. By sundown, everyone in Cedar County knew that the Freeman kid had bought 400 sacks of potatoes nobody would feed a hog. Freeman Farm sat 2 miles off Route 9, down a gravel drive lined with fence posts that leaned at the particular angle of wood that's been standing since before the man driving past was born. The house had been white once, and was mostly white still, chalky and faded and peeling at the corners where the sun hit hardest. The color old paint keeps out of habit long after it has any business keeping it. The barn had been red, and had gone the deep brick brown of red paint left too long in the weather. Wire fencing ran the near pastures, patched in places with newer wire that didn't match. The whole place carrying the visible history of ground kept up by one person doing the best he could with the money and the hours he had. That was Eli's whole inheritance, and he'd stepped into it more than a year ago now, on a February morning when his grandfather didn't come in from the barn, and Eli went out and found him. Moses Freeman had raised the boy since Eli was small, had been mother and father and teacher, all folded into one lean, patient, hard-handed old man. He'd taught Eli to read weather off the sky before Eli could read words off a page. And when his heart gave out between the stalls at 81, Eli was 20. And suddenly the only Freeman left to run the place. He ran it the only way he knew how, which was the way he'd been taught, by getting up before the light and staying out past it. There were 40-some laying hens and the small, dependable money that eggs brought from a handful of regular customers in town. There were 6 hogs behind the barn, enough to turn scraps into meat for the freezer and a little for sale. There was a vegetable patch that kept a stand going at the end of the drive, and hay some years, and none of it added up to much beyond keeping the lights on and the feed bills mostly paid. The farm was solvent, but only just, the way a swimmer treading water is technically not drowning. And there was Northridge Field, 40 acres on the north side of the property, and for as long as anyone in Cedar County could remember, 40 acres of nothing but disappointment. The soil there was heavy clay, laid down by some ancient lake bed, dense and rich in minerals in theory, and hostile to anything that needed to breathe through its roots in practice. In spring, the field held water like a bowl, standing puddles that took weeks to drain and drowned out whatever went in too early. By July, the same ground baked to something close to fired brick, cracked and hard-packed and resistant to a shovel, let alone a young root trying to push through it. The neighbors called it the brick field, and they'd been calling it that longer than Eli had been alive. Moses had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to fix it. He'd tried rotations and cover crops, and the drain line Garrett liked to bring up, which had helped some, and not enough. Never enough. Not on the money a small farm could spare. He'd never given up on the field exactly, and he'd never solved it either. When he died, it was still 40 acres of expensive nothing sitting at the edge of the property, like a debt that never came due and never went away. Eli had thought about selling the north acreage more than once. A neighbor had asked about it the past summer. Casual, over the fence, the kind of question that's really an offer wearing the clothes of curiosity. He hadn't sold it. He couldn't have given a clean reason why, even to himself, beyond the plain fact that his grandfather had spent 20 years trying to make that ground come alive, and something in Eli wasn't ready to be the freeman who finally let it go. He knew what the county thought of him. He was young, he was black, and he was farming alone in a place where most of the men who'd say hello to him at the co-op had also, at one time or another, looked at him and quietly decided how far they figured he'd get. Nobody said it out loud most days. They didn't have to. He'd grown up reading the space between what people said and what they meant, and he'd learned the same thing about that space that he'd learned about Garrett Pike on the dock. You didn't argue with it. You outlasted it. His grandfather had taught him that a man's words were cheap in a county like this one, and his work wasn't. If he wanted to change what a room thought of him when he walked into it, he'd better let the work do the talking, because the work was the only argument nobody could laugh off. So when the crowd laughed on the dock, it wasn't new. It was just louder than usual. The barn that first night was cold and smelled like a compost pile that hadn't finished cooking, and Eli worked in it close to midnight, sorting 400 sacks of potatoes by hand under the bare bulbs strung along the rafters. His breath showed in the cold. The bulbs swung a little every time the wind found a gap in the boards, and the shadows swung with them. He'd had a system in mind before he started, which was the thing nobody on the dock had understood. He hadn't bought the potatoes on a whim, or not entirely on a whim. He'd bought them because somewhere in the back of his mind, watching that loader shove perfectly good organic matter toward a dumpster, an idea had assembled itself faster than he could hold it up and examine it. And by the time he'd said the words out loud, the idea already had the shape it needed. 3 piles. The first was potatoes with strong, healthy sprouts, firm flesh under the sprouting, eyes that looked vigorous rather than desperate. Those were seed. The second was potatoes that had gone soft but hadn't crossed over into real rot, mushy in places but not foul, still a potato even if not one a person would want on a plate. Those were feed for the hogs and the hens, at a fraction of what grain was costing. And grain had been climbing all spring, a fact he'd heard griped about at the co-op more than once that month. The third pile was the ones that were gone, actively breaking down, leaking. Those were compost. Every sack that came off the truck belonged in one of those 3 piles, and part of what he was doing all night was training his hands to sort faster than his head could second-guess them. He worked through the sacks one at a time, writing as he went in the small spiral notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, a habit he'd picked up after his grandfather died, partly because it was useful, and partly because it was a way of staying close to how the old man had thought. By the time he finished, past midnight, hands cracked and cold and half numb from the wet burlap, the count read 286 sacks of seed, 71 of feed, 43 of compost only. He sat down on an overturned crate in the middle of the barn and looked at the 3 piles. The smell hung thick in the closed space, and potato juice had run out across the concrete in dark rivulets from the worst of the sacks. He opened one last bag off the compost pile, mechanical about it, checking the final few before he called it a night, and what was inside had gone completely to liquid, gray-brown, the ghost of the shape, and nothing more. He held that open sack in his lap for a while. He thought about the men on the dock. He thought about Garrett Pike's voice, and the drain line, and the 20 years, and the better farmer. He thought about the money he'd spent, which wasn't a fortune and wasn't nothing, not on this farm's margins, on what half the county considered garbage. What if they're right? The thought sat heavy in his chest, the way doubt sits heavy when you're alone and tired, and the thing you've committed to hasn't given you one shred of evidence yet that it will ever pay you back. He closed the sack. He set it on the compost pile. He turned off the barn lights and walked to the dark house. And he didn't sleep well. And in the morning he got up and went back out and kept working, because that was the only answer he had ever really trusted. 3 days after the sorting, on an evening when the wind rattled the loose kitchen window the way it always did in early spring, Eli pulled his grandfather's farm journals down from the shelf in the front room. There were 9 of them, spanning back almost 30 years. Moses Freeman had not been a man who wrote to hear himself think. Most of the entries were weather and planting dates and yields, problems and the fixes he'd tried against them. The plain record of a working farm. But every so often, usually late at night, the way his grandson now wrote late at night, the old man had allowed himself a longer thought, and Eli had learned to slow down when he hit one of those, because that was where the real man lived. He found the passage about Northridge in the 4th journal, dated 11 years back, in the tight, careful hand his grandfather used when he was tired. Tried the tile drain on the North 40 again this spring. Helped some, not enough. I keep thinking about this field wrong. I keep trying to force it to grow like it's ordinary ground, and it isn't ordinary ground. Not yet. This field doesn't need a miracle. It needs organic matter and patience, and something stubborn enough to grow before the soil is ready for it. I don't have the money to truck compost in by the ton. I don't have the years left in me to build it up slow, the way it ought to be built. Maybe the boy will have both someday. The money or the years. Maybe he'll figure something I couldn't. Eli read it twice. He sat at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of him, and he thought about the 3 piles waiting in the barn, and something that had been pulled tight in his chest since the dock loosened a little. His grandfather had written that when Eli was still a boy underfoot in the barn, had looked ahead 11 years to a man Eli hadn't become yet, and set a small, quiet bet on him. He wasn't planting food into Northridge, he was planting a beginning. And the old man had not only known it was possible, he'd guessed, years before he died, that it might fall to Eli to do the thing he couldn't. Maybe the boy will have both. Eli had the material now, 400 sacks of it sitting in the barn. He didn't have the money his grandfather never had either. But he had something the old man had run out of, which was time. A whole life of seasons stretching out ahead of him to give this field what it needed 1 year at a stretch. He took his own notebook out and wrote under the day's date in a hand that was starting to look like the one in the journal. Granddad knew what this field needed. He didn't have the material. I've got 400 sacks of it. Seed to start something living. Feed to cut costs somewhere else so I can afford to be patient. Compost to change what's actually wrong with the dirt. This isn't a gamble. This is doing what he couldn't afford to do. He closed the journal and set it back on the shelf. And then he changed his mind and carried it to the kitchen table instead and left it there, open, where he could see it for the rest of the season. The feed store in Cedar County ran on the same fuel every rural feed store runs on, genuine agricultural need and the informal social network that assembles around it. Eli went in that Tuesday for chicken feed and hog supplement, and he felt the room shift the moment he came through the door. Not dramatically, just in the specific way a room shifts when the conversation happening in it was, until 30 seconds ago, about the person who just walked in. The talk didn't stop. It only changed register. Somebody near the fertilizer shelf said something about 400 sacks for that dead clay field, and somebody else said the boy must be worse off than they'd thought. And neither of them bothered to lower his voice much, because it hadn't occurred to either of them that Eli's opinion of the matter was worth managing. He kept his face level. He set his order down at the counter with Ronnie, who ran the register and had the decency not to join in, and while Ronnie was pulling the supplement bags, the 2 men by the shelf kept right on going. Miller Creek boys already lost half their spring planting to standing water, the first one said. That bottomland soaked clean through. Prices are going to climb by fall if nobody picks up the slack. Not going to be the Freeman kid picking up any slack, the second one said. Not off that field. Garrett Pike came around the end of an aisle with a bag of chick starter under his arm and looked at Eli with the expression of a man who's been enjoying a story and just had a better ending handed to him in person. Heard you bought Phil Gentry's whole reject pile, Garrett said. I did. What's the plan for 400 sacks of rot? Plant some, feed some to the animals, compost the rest, Eli said, because it was true, and because there was no version of the truth that would have satisfied Garrett anyway. Garrett looked genuinely delighted by the answer. The way a man looks when a joke he's already decided is funny gets funnier with detail. You're going to plant it in the brick field. That's right. That field beat your granddad for 20 years. Beat him with good seed and a drain line he paid a contractor for. He knew that ground better than you ever will, and it still won. Garrett let that settle before he set the hook. And you're going to beat it with what Phil Gentry couldn't give away. Ronnie set the supplement on the counter without quite looking at either of them. We'll see, Eli said. He paid. He carried his own bags out and loaded them. And he didn't say anything else. He drove home with his jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. It wasn't the part about the potatoes that stayed with him the whole drive. He could carry that. It was, he knew that ground better than you ever will, and it still won. That was the part that found the soft place and pressed. He pulled up in the drive and sat in the truck a minute before he went in, and he thought about Moses out in that field in every kind of weather for 20 years, trying things and failing and trying again and never quite getting there. And he thought about Garrett Pike using that history for a punchline over a feed store counter, for the price of a laugh from two men by a fertilizer shelf. He went inside. He didn't come apart, but something in him had decided, somewhere between the counter and the driveway, that Northridge was not going to stay a joke. And filed right next to that decision, without his quite noticing it settle, was the other thing he'd overheard. Miller Creek, soaked clean through, half the spring planting lost. He didn't make much of it that night. He'd make a great deal more of it by August. The next 2 weeks were swallowed whole by the work of turning 286 sacks of sprouted potatoes into planting material, and it was slower and more exacting than he'd expected. Not every sprouted potato went in whole. Most had to be cut into seed pieces, each one a section carrying at least one strong eye, roughly the size of an egg, enough stored energy to feed the new sprout until it built roots of its own. Cut a piece too small, and it wouldn't carry the sprout. Cut it careless, and rot could travel out of a bad section into a good one. It was the kind of work that looked simple from the outside and turned out to be all judgment once your hands were in it. He set up a cutting station on a folding table in the barn, a board, a sharpened knife, one bucket for the pieces and one for the waste, and the waste went straight to the compost. He worked it in stretches, a few hours at a time across almost 2 weeks, until the small muscles in his cutting hand ached in a way they never had before, and by the time he was done, he'd cut 11,000 seed pieces and change out of those 286 sacks. "This is not a garden," he wrote that night. "This is a planting." Garrett drove past the barn on the third day of the cutting and saw every flat surface inside covered with halved potatoes drying under the rafters. He slowed his truck and leaned toward the open door. "You feeding the whole state, or just trying to embarrass the rest of us?" Eli didn't look up from the board. Garrett drove on. The cut pieces had to cure before they went anywhere near soil. A freshly cut potato is an open wound, and open wounds rot the moment they hit wet ground. Given a few days in a cool, dry, airy space, the cut face calluses over and seals itself. So Eli spread the pieces in shallow layers across the barn. Old feed sacks over hay bales, window screens laid across sawhorses, and dusted the cut sides with wood ash from the farmhouse stove, which dried the wounds faster and kept the soft rot down. It took 4 days for most of them to callus properly, and he turned them by hand twice a day, so no piece sat wet against the wood too long. During those 4 days, he worked the 71 sacks of feed-grade potatoes into the hogs and the hens, cooking batches down over an outdoor fire and mashing them into the ration at a careful ratio he adjusted as he watched the animals respond. The hogs took to it right off. The hens came around inside a week. That alone made a real dent in what the farm was spending, with grain climbing the way it had been all spring, and he wrote as much in the notebook. Feed savings already showing. This much may have been worth the money before the field ever comes into it. The 43 sacks of true rot went into the compost bays, layered with straw and hen manure and dried leaves he'd stockpiled. And inside a week, the first bay was steaming faintly in the cool morning air, the visible sign of the invisible work. Northridge in early spring looked exactly like its reputation. Eli walked it slow before he did anything to it, the way Moses had walked it in front of him 1,000 times without ever calling it a lesson. The clay was heavy and cold underfoot, still holding winter's water in the low spots. He pushed a shovel into a few test places and got what he expected. Dense, sticky soil that clung to the blade in wet gray clumps, next to no organic matter in it, no dark, crumbly humus, no earthworms, nothing but heavy mineral clay packed down by years of standing water and years of nothing growing in it to hold it together any other way. He marked off 6 acres, the driest draining stretch, closest to the slight grade that let water move off fastest in spring, and decided 6 acres would be the test. He wasn't going to bet the whole 40 on a method he'd never run before. 6 acres was enough to learn from and small enough to survive losing. He built raised ridges about 8 inches high, running with the slope, and laid compost strips along a portion of the rows and left the rest without so he could read the difference later. He put the first section in the ground in late April, 11,000 seed pieces going down over the better part of 10 days. "This is the beginning Granddad wrote about," he put in the notebook the night the first section was in. The rain came 8 days after the first planting, and it came hard, a soaking 3-day rain. Nothing a storm chaser would drive out to see, just the ordinary spring rain Cedar County got most years, and that most fields drank down without complaint. Northridge did what Northridge always did. The lower sections of the planted acreage began holding standing water between the ridges inside a day, and by the 3rd day, that water had crept up into the base of the ridges themselves, soaking the soil around the buried seed pieces. Eli stood at the kitchen window that whole 3rd night, watching the rain come down and already knowing, in the part of him that had grown up on this ground, what he'd find when it stopped. He knew what it meant before he ever walked out to check. He dug test holes along the lowest run of rows, and what came up in his hand was close to the worst thing it could have been. Seed pieces that should have been firming up and pushing roots had gone soft instead, and some had gone all the way to liquid. The same gray-brown slime from that first sack in the barn. Only now it was happening in the ground, in pieces he'd spent hours cutting and curing and planting. By the time he'd worked his way across the worst-hit 1/3 of the planting, he put the loss near 3,000 seed pieces. He wrote the number down that night because writing it down was the only way he had of making himself look straight at it. 3,000 pieces rotted in the first rain, lower sections. Standing water got into the base before the ridge dried. This is what happens when you don't give clay enough lift. Word traveled Cedar County the way it always did, which is fast, and without much regard for the feelings of the person it was about. Garrett heard inside the week and made sure Eli knew he'd heard. He didn't even get out of his truck at the gas station, just rolled the window down while Eli was filling his tank and put it out loud enough to carry over the pump. "Told you that field eats everything you put in it, same as it ate every dollar your granddad ever put in it." Eli didn't answer. He finished filling the tank. He drove home. He walked out to Northridge near dusk after the evening chores were done, and he knelt in the mud at the worst section of the failed planting. The ground came up cold through his jeans. The light was going gray-blue, and the field around him, 6 acres of raised ridges, half of them showing the thin, sad gaps where seed pieces had rotted instead of rising, looked exactly like the thing everyone had told him it would be. He dug his hand into the base of one of the worst ridges and drew out what was left of a seed piece, and it came apart between his fingers. Gray-brown and slick and cold. Nothing left of the potato it had been, and nothing yet of the plant it was supposed to become. He sat back on his heels in the mud and let the question come all the way up, because he didn't have the strength left that evening to hold it off. What if they were right? Maybe his grandfather had never solved this field because the field couldn't be solved. Maybe 20 years of a good farmer's best and a boy's $400 of reject potatoes after him was never going to be enough against 40 acres of clay that had been wrong since before either of them drew breath. Maybe the county was right about the field and right about him, and the two things had always been the same thing. He let himself think about selling it all the way through for the first time. Sell the 40 acres, take whatever it brought, put the money into the parts of the farm that already worked, and stop bleeding hours into ground that maybe never wanted anything to live in it. The mud was cold and his knees ached, and he almost stood up to walk back to the house with that decision made behind his eyes. Then, in the very last of the light, doing the thing he always did even when he didn't mean to, looking, checking, paying attention, he caught something 2 rows over. A single seed piece, planted in one of the compost strip rows, on a stretch of ground that sat a little higher and drained a little better than the rest. There was a sprout on it, small, pale green, no more than 3 inches, pushed up through the clay in the one place where the drainage had held and the compost had done something, even a small something, to loosen the ground enough to let it through. He stayed kneeling in the mud and looked at it a long while. One surviving sprout against 3,000 lost pieces wasn't proof of anything working. But it told him something specific and useful, and it told it to him plainly. Where the drainage was better, and where the compost had gone in, something had lived that hadn't lived anywhere else. That wasn't a miracle. That was data. The field hadn't beaten him. The method had. And a method was a thing you could change. He stood up stiff and cold, his jeans ruined, and walked back to the house in the dark. And that night he sat at the kitchen table with his grandfather's journal open beside his own and worked out what had gone wrong and what the one survivor was trying to tell him to change. Change the method. Higher ridges. Straw mulch on top. Cut drainage channels between the worst rows to carry the water off. Concentrate the compost right under where each piece sits instead of spreading it thin. Start from the driest ground and work toward the wettest. 3,000 lost, 8,000 left. That's still 8,000 chances. The second phase of planting looked different because Eli had changed nearly everything about his method based on what the failure had taught him. He built the ridges higher, a foot to 14 inches now instead of 8, because the one survivor had told him plainly that clay this heavy needed lift, and more lift than he'd given it. He cut drainage channels between the rows, angled to carry the excess water off the field entirely, instead of letting it pool in the low spots. He mulched the ridge tops with straw to hold moisture without drowning the pieces. And he concentrated the last of his compost directly beneath where each seed piece would sit, at the root zone, instead of spreading it thin the way he had the first time. He started with the driest ground and worked outward toward the wet, holding the worst draining sections for last, so that if he lost anything again, he'd lose it in the ground he already knew was hardest. He planted the remaining 8,000 seed pieces over 12 days in May, dawn to dark, alone. Except for one Saturday, when a neighbor boy named Sam came up the drive asking if there was any work going, and Eli put him on the drainage channels while he handled the seed pieces himself. The boy dug well and didn't talk much, which Eli appreciated, and at the end of the day, Eli paid him out of the egg money, and the boy said he'd come back if there was more. There wasn't, not that season. But Eli remembered him and made a note of it, because a man farming alone learns quick which of his neighbors will show up when there's dirt to move. 8,000 pieces in the ground, he wrote when the last row was done. Ridges higher, drainage cut, straw down, compost right at the root. This is everything I know how to do differently. Now it's watch and wait. The first test came fast, and it came before the rows ever had a chance to prove themselves. Colorado potato beetles found Northridge in early June, while the young plants were still low and tender and only just clear of the soil. Small striped insects that could strip a plant's leaves fast enough to set it back or kill it outright before it ever bulked up underground. Eli found the first clutch of eggs on the underside of a leaf during a morning walk, yellow-orange, unmistakable, and he knew what a field full of them could do to a planting this young. He didn't have the budget for commercial treatment across 6 acres. What he had was hens. Moving a portable enclosure through the infested rows and letting the birds clean up the beetles and the larvae before shifting them along was a real strategy, an old one, and it cost nothing but the labor of moving the pen. His first try at it wasn't well calibrated. Too many birds in too small a section, left too long, and the beetles got cleaned up, but the hens also scratched and pecked at the young plants themselves, damaging stems and uprooting a handful of the shallow-rooted seedlings before he understood what was happening and pulled them off it. Chicken rotation worked on the beetles, he wrote that night, more annoyed at himself than anything. But it cost me at least a dozen plants. Too many birds, too long, too small an area. Adjust. And he did. The same way he'd adjusted everything else. By reading the failure instead of arguing with it. He rebuilt the enclosure smaller, ran fewer hens through each section on a tighter schedule, and filled the gaps by hand, walking the rows in the early morning with a bucket of soapy water, knocking the beetles and larvae into it one at a time. It was slow and unglamorous, and it cost nothing but hours, which was still the one thing he had more of than money. By the end of June, the beetle pressure was manageable, and the hens were fatter for it besides. And then, 6 weeks on from that second planting, the young rows that had come through the beetles came into their own. Not scattered survivors this time, one lonely sprout against 3,000 losses. Actual rows. Thin in the places where the soil was still working against him, stronger where the ground was higher and better drained. But real, consistent lines of potato plants standing up green through the raised ridges. He walked the 6 acres the morning he was sure of it, up one row and down the next, and made himself say it plainly in the notebook, so he wouldn't talk himself out of believing it later. First real rows. Not perfect. Gaps in the low sections still. But this is a crop now. Not an accident. A crop. The Miller Creek losses he'd overheard about at the feed store back in April had not been idle talk. They turned out to be the front edge of a season that got harder for the rest of the county as it wore on. The same standing water that had cost Eli 3,000 seed pieces had hit the low-lying bottomland fields along the creek far worse. And unlike Eli, the bigger commercial operations down there hadn't kept a second batch of 11,000 cured seed pieces sitting ready in a barn. A washout for them meant a lost season, not a chance to change the method and go again. Then the summer turned dry. Not a true drought, but dry enough. And dry on top of the earlier flooding stressed whatever plantings had made it and cut yields across several of the county's growers. By August, the effect had reached town. Potatoes, the most basic and dependable staple the county grew, the thing nobody ever worried about, had gotten hard to find in quantity and were costing noticeably more. The school district's summer kitchen, getting ready for the fall lunch program, put in calls to the local growers and found less potato available than it had counted on, at higher prices than it had budgeted. The church pantry over on Elm Street watched its usual potato donations shrink along with everyone's yields. The diner on Main Street, which put potatoes on nearly every plate it served, started paying more per hundredweight than it had planned for, and began quietly working out whether it would have to raise the price of its plainest dishes. None of it touched Eli directly, not yet. He was still out in 6 acres that had survived a flood and a beetle infestation and his own learning curve, wondering whether the ground under all that green held anything worth digging up or whether the tops were the whole of it. He dug his first test row in the second week of September, using a spading fork instead of a shovel so he wouldn't slice through tubers he couldn't see yet. He worked it into the base of one of the plants in the highest, best draining section and levered it up slow and turned the soil over. The potatoes came up out of the clay clean. Not enormous, but real. Solid, smooth-skinned. Several to the plant. He crouched there in the row a long moment, turning one over in his hand, thumbing the dirt off it, and then he did the arithmetic he'd been afraid to do, comparing it against the yields his grandfather had recorded off that same ground in the old journals. Best section is running close to 4 times what that dirt should give, going by Granddad's records, he wrote that night. And then, Because he didn't want to lie to himself even in his own favor, he wrote the reason down too. Not because the whole field is fixed, because the sections I amended and drained and mulched right responded exactly the way the theory said they would. The lower sections, still sitting on the worst draining ground, gave a smaller yield, real and usable, but clearly still fighting soil that hadn't had enough treatment in it yet. That was honest, and he wanted it honest. But the overall harvest across the full 6 acres, finished in the last week of September, came to several times what anyone, Eli himself in his more doubtful moments, would have called out of that ground. The first thing he did with it was settle his own accounts. He drove to the feed store and paid off the balance on his spring feed bill in full, something he'd normally have carried partway into winter, and he watched Ronnie ring it out without a word, which from Ronnie was its own kind of respect. He set potatoes aside for his own kitchen and pulled the best of them for next year's seed stock. Then he loaded the truck and drove to Route 9 Farm Market. Phil Gentry was on the loading dock, and Eli watched him register what was happening as the truck backed up to the same dock where, 5 months earlier, Phil had helped him load 400 sacks of what his own market had been about to throw away. Phil came down and lifted one of the potatoes out of the crate, weighing it in his palm, reading it with the flat of his thumb the way a working man can't help doing, and his face did something complicated. "These came off Northridge," Eli said. 6 acres of it. "This is good stock, Eli." Phil said it plainly. No wonder dressed up in it, just a working man acknowledging a fact he could feel with his own hands. "This is good stock." He sold to the market at a fair price. Then he drove to the school district's procurement office and offered a set quantity under what the district had been quoted from its regional supplier. And the woman behind the desk looked at him twice. Once the ordinary way, and once the way people look when the arithmetic in front of them doesn't match the story they'd heard. He drove to the church pantry on Elm Street and donated a portion outright, and the volunteer running it that week put her arms around him before she thought to ask whether that was all right, and he let her, because some things you let happen. He sold to the diner on Main Street at a price that let the owner hold his menu through the fall without raising a thing. And at his own farm stand at the end of the gravel drive, he put up a hand-lettered sign that read, "Northridge Potatoes," and inside the first week, trucks were turning down the drive in a steady stream he had never seen at his own operation in his life. On the second Saturday in October, a woman he recognized from the elementary school office pulled up, loaded 2 full crates into the back of a district van and said, before she drove off, that they were going into 300 lunch trays the next morning. Eli stood in the driveway a while after the van had gone, and that sentence stayed with him longer than almost anything else that fall. 300 trays. Off the brick field. Off the ground everyone had told him was dead. At the market a week later, Phil Gentry stood at the same dock where he'd watched the boy load 400 sacks of reject potatoes in April, this time stacking crates of Northridge stock onto his own shelves, and he stopped what he was doing to watch the line at the counter. 5 people deep, every one of them asking for the same thing. He looked over at Eli and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Garrett Pike came to the farm stand on that second Saturday in October. Eli saw the truck come down the drive and felt the specific tightening in his chest that he still hadn't fully worked past. The one that went all the way back to the gas station, to same as it ate every dollar your granddad ever put in it. Garrett got out and walked up and looked at the crates for a long moment before he looked at Eli. These really came off the brick field. They did. Garrett lifted one and studied it, holding it up against the light, reading it with his hands the way a farmer can't help doing with produce. "I heard you lost thousands of seed pieces in that first rain." 3,000 out of 11, Eli said. "And you just replanted, changed the method, and put the other 8,000 in the ground." "Yes." Garrett set the potato back down in the crate, careful about it, and went quiet in a way Eli had never once seen from him. "I laughed at you back in April on that dock," Garrett said, "and again at the gas station. I said things about your granddad I had no business saying." He wasn't looking at Eli quite straight now. I saw 400 sacks of rot going onto a truck headed for a field that beat every good farmer who ever tried it, your granddad included. I saw rot, and I saw a bad field, and I put the two together, and I figured I already knew how the story ended. Figured I knew what a kid your age could do with it too, which was the worst part of it if I'm being square with you. Eli let him get all the way there before he said anything. You saw sprouts and rot, Eli said. I saw a field that needed a beginning. Garrett stood with that a moment. That's a better way of putting it than I'd have come up with. He bought 2 full bags, more than one household needed, Eli suspected, though he didn't say so, and as he loaded them into the bed of his truck, not quite looking over, he got to the thing he'd really come to say. You're going to keep working that field, the rest of the acreage, the drainage, whatever you've got planned for next spring. He shut the tailgate. I've got a tractor, and I've got some time most Aprils. If you want the help, it's there. Eli looked at him a moment. I might take you up on that. By the time the harvest was fully in and sold, Eli had a clear-eyed picture of what he'd actually done, because he'd kept the notebook the whole way through, and a notebook doesn't let you round up in your own favor the way memory will. 6 acres out of 40 had been treated, drained, mulched, amended, planted, and replanted with close attention through every stage. Those 6 acres had produced a real, meaningful harvest, several times what the untreated ground would have given, and that was proof his grandfather's old journal entry had been right all along, that the field didn't need a miracle, only organic matter and patience, and something stubborn enough to grow before the soil was ready. But 34 acres remained exactly what they had always been. Heavy clay, poor drainage, no organic matter worth the name, waiting for their own turn at the same slow work. He wrote it out honestly the night the last of the money was accounted for. Northridge is not fixed. 6 acres are different than they were in April. 34 are not. Not yet. This was never going to be a one-season miracle, and I'm glad I never let myself believe it would be. Because the 6 acres that worked because I paid attention to every failure and adjusted, instead of quitting or pretending the failures didn't happen. Next spring, expand the treated ground. More compost. A full season of potato waste compost finished now and ready. More drainage. And Garrett Pike offered his tractor, which I didn't expect and am not too proud to use. Granddad wrote that this field needed patience. He didn't say how much. I don't think there's a number. I think you just keep giving it what it needs, until it stops needing it. But I know this much. 400 sacks of potatoes nobody wanted fed my hogs and my hens through a summer of climbing feed prices, built the compost that changed 6 acres of dead clay and put food on tables at the school, the pantry, the diner, and half the kitchens in Cedar County this fall. Nobody's laughing at the brick field anymore. That's not the same thing as the field being fixed, but it's the same thing as the work being real. The following April, Eli stood at the edge of Northridge with Garrett Pike's tractor running behind him, marking out 12 new acres to bring into the treated rotation. Double what he'd managed the year before, made possible by a full season of finished compost and by everything written into the notebook he'd been filling since the day he watched a loader shove 400 sacks of rejected potatoes toward a dumpster and said, without quite knowing why, "I'll take all of them." Phil Gentry had called him twice over the winter, once about a load of soft onions the market couldn't move, and once about a pallet of bruised apples, and both times Eli had said yes, and both times the material had gone exactly where it needed to go. Seed where seed made sense. Feed where feed made sense. Compost where nothing else would do. The school kitchen had already put in an early order for the fall. The diner owner had asked if Eli could supply him straight through the winter this time. The pantry volunteer had started saving him a seat at the Wednesday coffee, which, in Cedar County terms, was its own kind of admission into something. He didn't think of any of it as a victory exactly. Victory implied an ending, and he understood by now that Northridge wasn't the kind of problem that ended. It was the kind you kept working season after season, giving it what it needed until, gradually, It needed less. Most of the men standing behind Route 9 Farm Market that April afternoon a year ago had seen 400 sacks of spoiled potatoes headed for a dumpster, and a boy too young and too green to know better. Eli Freeman had seen seed. He'd seen feed. He'd seen compost. He'd seen a field his grandfather had spent 20 years trying to wake up, still waiting, still stubborn, still his to keep working. He looked out at the 6 acres that had come through their first full year of treatment, the soil there visibly darker now than the clay around it, holding together differently when he pressed his boot into it. Then he looked at the 34 acres still waiting, and he thought about the old man who'd guessed, years before he died, that the boy might have the time he never did. He started the tractor.